Well, another good Wednesday evening to you folks. I hope that everybody is doing well. I'm doing well myself. Are you ready for some Bible study? I hope so. As we continue to look at the Sermon on the Mount, I hope that you will open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. Of course, the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5, 6, and 7, but we are still in chapter 5. And so if you've got your Bibles, chapter 5 of Matthew is where you want to be, verses 31 and 32. That is going to be the object of our focus tonight. Matthew chapter 5 verses 31 and 32. Okay, as we begin, when I read verses 31 and 32, I am reminded of John chapter 6 verses 22 through 59. Now, what's the connection there? Well, the connection is kind of tenuous, but nevertheless it reminds me of it. In John chapter 6, verses 22 through 59, that's where we have Jesus giving a major discourse called the Bread of Life Discourse. And in that Bread of Life Discourse, Jesus tells His followers that if they want to live forever, they're going to have to eat His flesh and they're going to have to drink His blood. Now, it was obvious what Jesus was saying, and everybody understood that idiom that He was using. To eat His flesh and drink His blood meant that they had to completely take Him into themselves. They had to bring Him, His life, and His teaching into their innermost being and give themselves completely to Jesus now. By taking Him in, His life and His teaching, into their innermost being, they are going to have to live like Him. They're going to have to think like Him. They're going to have to behave like Him. Their attitudes and their motives have to reflect His. That's what He meant. And they understood that. But then when you get down to verse 60, after the Bread of Life discourse is over, you will read these words. Many therefore of His disciples, when they heard this, said, "This is a difficult statement. Who can listen to it?" Now, when they said that, they didn't mean it's difficult to understand. It was not difficult to understand. What they meant was it's difficult to accept. Well, with that in mind, as we're going through the Sermon on the Mount, there's a lot of things that are really kind of just tough. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount, like C.S. Lewis once said, it's like getting hit between the eyes with a 2x4. It really helps you to see not only what God expects of you as a kingdom subject, but it really helps you to see how woefully short we fall as kingdom subjects. It is a reminder of how desperately we need the grace and the mercy of God through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. But as challenging as it all is, when we get to verse 31 and 32, I am reminded that these two verses, this is a difficult statement that Jesus makes. Not difficult in the sense that it's hard to understand, but difficult in the sense that the people in John chapter 6 used it when they listened to Jesus say, "You got to eat my flesh and you got to drink my blood." It was difficult for them to accept. Well, verse 31 and 32, it's not hard to understand, but wow, it is hard to accept. So with that in mind, let's take a look at verse 31 and 32. It was said, "Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Okay, the first thing that we need to say is this principle works both ways. Even though it talks about a man divorcing his wife, that principle extends to the entire marriage relationship. In principle, it's the exact same, whether it's a husband, whether it's a wife. Okay, with that out of the way. As we look at verse 31 and verse 32, we may kind of instinctively think, okay, a new subject Jesus is dealing with here. But it's not really a new subject. Actually, Jesus is continuing His discussion of what constitutes adultery. Remember, if you were with us on Sunday, Jesus talked about that in verses 27 through 30, what constitutes adultery. And in verses 27 through 30, he said, you've committed adultery in your heart when you focus your attention on someone other than your spouse for the purpose of arousing and satisfying sexual desire. It's adultery when you make someone other than your spouse the object of your sexual desire. And now he moves into 31 and 32, and he adds to that. And as he does that, he counters a very popular Jewish notion at the time that was based on a faulty reading of something that we find in the book of Deuteronomy. Turn over, if you will, to Deuteronomy chapter 24. Deuteronomy chapter 24. And when you get there, verse 1 is where you want to be. Deuteronomy 24, beginning in verse 1. Here we go. Moses says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives to you as an inheritance. Okay, the Jews understood this language of Deuteronomy chapter 24 to mean that, well, divorce is a completely legitimate option. It is something that is completely sanctioned by God. He is okay with it. In their mind, these words gave them God's stamp of approval to pursue divorce. That's what they thought these 4 verses were all about. It was God's permission to say, hey, it's okay for you to get divorced. There was no need to debate whether God cared about divorce or not. He obviously was okay with divorce in their minds. All that this did, the only debate about these 4 verses in the Jewish world was, what's the precise meaning of that vague phrase, if he finds some indecency in her? That's the only debate. What does that mean? There was no debate on whether God allowed it. In their minds, God was just fine with it. Well, when it came to the matter of what it meant to find some indecency in her, there were various schools of thought that were popular. For instance, there was one teaching that was represented by the school of a rabbi named Shammai. And in Shammai's view, this idea of indecency within a spouse was some form of immorality. And so his followers were taught that the indecency is if you find some form of immorality. But then there was another prominent school of thought. It was represented by the school of another rabbi named Hillel. And Hillel said, no, when it comes to indecency, it's not just talking about some form of immorality. It is really talking about virtually anything that a husband might find displeasing, including something so trivial as burning dinner. If that is, if a husband finds that to be, to have some strong resistance against that, he finds that to be indecent because it covers that, then he is more than free to get a divorce. And then there was another teaching later by a man named Rabbi Akiba, who said, what this matter of indecency is if the husband is attracted to someone that he finds to be more beautiful than his wife, then he can give her a certificate of divorce. So you have all kinds of views on what it means to find something indecent in one's wife. But we need to understand that this teaching in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, it is not a divine sanction for divorce. To see this as God giving His people permission to get divorced is to see it all wrong. The passage is a concession by God. There's no doubt about that. Jesus even makes that clear when He gets over into chapter 19 and verse 8. he's going to say, Moses permitted it because of the hardness of your heart. It was a concession by God, a concession to their stubborn, hard, sinful hearts. But instead of implying that it's God's permission to get a divorce, what he's trying to do, what God is trying to do here in Deuteronomy chapter 24, is he's trying to bring some restraint to divorce. If you bought into Rabbi Akiba's view, divorce would be rampant. Hey, when you find someone more beautiful than your wife, that you think is more beautiful than your wife, then just give your wife a certificate of divorce and send her on her way. Divorce would be rampant. Or if everyone bought into Hillel's school of thought, hey, anything is, falls under the umbrella of indecency. Your wife burns dinner, you get sick and tired of eating burnt food, by all means, give her a certificate of divorce and find somebody else. Now, that's not the purpose is to restrain it. It is to limit it. God knows it's going to happen, but he is going to limit it among his people. He doesn't want his people to get a divorce. He makes a concession to them, but he is going to try to limit that. And he does that by saying, in effect, you better think hard before you divorce your wife, because you can't ever have her back. That's the point of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. If you give your wife a certificate of divorce, you send her on her way, and she gets married to someone else, and that husband puts her away, or he dies, you can't have her back. Once it's done, it's done. And so they completely misunderstood, the Jews of Jesus' day misunderstood Deuteronomy chapter 24. They think this is all about God's permission to basically have, divorce carte blanche. But that's not what it's about. It is about restraining it. Now, so what Jesus says, let's go back now to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, and let's take a look again at what Jesus says here. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. You think that the biggest issue, you think that all God cares about is getting the right paperwork done. If you want to divorce your wife, just make sure you get the paperwork done right. But Jesus is coming along and he's saying, now let me tell you what the truth is. There is a much bigger truth than getting the paperwork right when it comes to the matter of divorce. And here is, Jesus says, that bigger truth. If you divorce your spouse for any reason other than sexual immorality, the New American Standard says unchastity. We're going to talk about that in a minute. If you divorce your wife for any reason other than sexual immorality, you are making her commit adultery. And you're making whoever marries her, or your spouse, commit adultery. Makes her commit adultery. What does he mean, he makes her commit adultery? Well, what you're doing is if you leave your spouse for some other reason other than sexual immorality, and you are promoting an adulterous union, because it assumes, Jesus is assuming here, a first century culture where a divorced woman is going to naturally remarry. That's what's going to happen. And he's saying that if you put her away for some other reason other than unfaithfulness, you are driving her into a union that she doesn't have a right to. And whoever marries her, or him, flip-flop, whoever marries her is now in a union that person doesn't have any right to. Now, when Jesus says this, he is clearly implying then what God's will for marriage is. And that is, it is to be an absolute permanent thing. Period. Full stop. God's will for marriage, God's plan for marriage, is that one man and one woman will get married and they will stay married for the rest of their lives until one of them dies, period. No divorce. Now, if you go over to Matthew chapter 19, that is stated. It's not implied. It's implied in this text, Matthew chapter 5. It is stated in Matthew chapter 19. So why don't we look over there? Matthew chapter 19, look down at verse 6. Or let's just start here. Let's just start in verse 1. Let's get the whole context here. When Jesus had finished these words, he departed from Galilee, came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." Jesus doesn't mince words. That is God's plan. One man, one woman for life. Now, apparently, to accommodate the harsh realities of the real world, Jesus says there is one exception to that. Now, in Matthew chapter 5 there, we read that is described in the New American Standard as unchastity. Here in Matthew chapter 19, look at verse 9, and this response comes from verse 7. After Jesus says, "Let no man separate what God joined together, let no man separate." They said, "Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?" And Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." So, to accommodate the harsh realities of this world, Jesus says there is one exception that God makes available. One exception to God's complete, total prohibition of divorce, and that is if one spouse commits porneia. When a spouse commits porneia, then the innocent partner may have another spouse, and that does not constitute an adulterous union. So let's talk about this word porneia. Go back to Matthew chapter 5. That's the word, as I said, that the New American Standard here translates as unchastity. And it's the same word that Jesus uses in Matthew 9:9 that's translated in the New American Standard, immorality. Unchastity, immorality is a translation of the word porneia. I am sure that I don't have to tell you that we get words porn, pornography, pornographic from this Greek word porneia. It is a sexual word. And so the word encompasses any form of sexual immorality. In fact, I like how the NIV translates it. It captures this meaning of sexual immorality when it translates it in both places, marital unfaithfulness, except for marital unfaithfulness. Now, a lot of people, listen, don't try to play legalistic games with this idea of marital unfaithfulness, by the way. Now, what I mean by that, some people do play legalistic games, and they'll say, well, what does that mean? Explain to me what it means so I will know what line to cross. And I know how far I can go and not commit marital unfaithfulness. And so they're playing these legalistic games. And so you'll hear some people say, well, this act, he is referring to the consummate act of sex. He's referring to sexual intercourse here. And so if you stop short of that, then you have not committed marital unfaithfulness. You have not committed porneia. That is, let's see, how do I say this? Hogwash. There you go. That's a good way to put it. That idea is absolute and utter hogwash. It is nonsense. The word porneia is far more broad than that. And so Jesus is saying, if your spouse has betrayed you sexually, then God grants the innocent person to have another. But if one spouse has defiled the marriage bed, you may have another spouse, and your new relationship will not be an adulterous union. But if you divorce your spouse, Jesus says, for some other reason other than sexual immorality, you marry another, you commit adultery. That's a difficult statement. Like I said earlier, it's not difficult to understand. Listen, that is simple to understand. It is difficult to accept because so many people in our world are touched by divorce. It is so difficult because it is so normal. It ought not be that way. Divorce should not be an issue in the kingdom of God. Among God's people, in His church, divorce should not be an issue. God expects us to respect His plan, one man, one woman, for life. One rare exception, and that is sexual betrayal. Difficult not to understand, but difficult to accept. Well, last week when we talked about we're trying to rid ourselves of, letting illicit sexual desire find its home in our heart, I gave some practical suggestions. So let's give some practical advice this week. As we think about this and what Jesus' will is, as He expresses the Father's will about adultery and marriage, let's get a little practical advice here that's going to help us avoid committing adultery from divorce. Now, this is nothing new, of course. You've heard this before. There have been times whenever we have talked about and come across these texts on marriage, and I always go back to this, and I always will go back to it any time that I talk about how to prevent divorce. I always go back to this first and foremost. I always talk first and foremost to those who are not yet married. And I try to drill in their head, this is God's plan. It is simple to understand. It is simple. This is God's plan. So, first of all, how do you avoid violating God's plan? You choose carefully. You've got a one-shot deal. You better choose carefully. You better ignore those voices that are either in your head or coming from outside of you that says you're overthinking this. Don't analyze it too much. You're destroying romance. That also is utter hogwash. You date with your brain. You date with your eyes wide open. You better see what this person is. You better listen to what this person is. And whatever they're showing you, you better believe it. You better not make an excuse for immoral behavior, ungodly behavior, illegal behavior. You better date with your eyes wide open. You need to ask a lot of questions about their family, about how they verbally treat you, how they physically treat you. Are they interested in spiritual matters? Do they share your belief systems doctrinally? Does their heart seem to be enamored by the wealth and power of the world? Or, what kind of close friends? What are the people like that they enjoy hanging around the most? What kind of reputation do they have? What kind of goals and plans do they have in the future? Do they have a good work ethic? All kinds of things you need to be asking yourself. So the first piece of advice of how we avoid this is, okay, if you're not married, understand, you better choose carefully. That's number one. Now let's move to marriage. What about those who are already married? Okay, they've already chosen. God has already joined them together. Now what? Okay, one of the things that you need to do is avoid divorce language. That's one of the most important things. What I always say about this, and you'll hear this a lot. That's why you'll hear this counsel a lot from people who deal with marriage issues. Divorce language can sometimes be rampant. If you don't, I'm going home. If you don't stop this, if you don't start that, if you go here, then you're going alone. If you don't stop this, I'm going home. It's the language of separation. You've got to stop that. You got to start working through the reality that you are one. God has made you one. And you got to start communicating. You got to start listening to each other. You got to start talking about what's important to one another. You got to start talking about emotional needs that are important. You've got to start listening attentively to one another. And that leads to this. That leads to another another word of counsel, some practical advice, is you need to avail yourselves of resources out there that will help you build a strong relationship. You need to learn what your spouse's emotional needs are. My favorite book, many of you already know this, is the book His Needs, Her Needs by Willard Harley. It emphasizes the fact that men and women, that we all have certain emotional needs. And those emotional needs aren't the same. And one of the ways to affair-proof your marriage is to really pay attention, learn what your spouse's emotional needs are, and then you put real purpose and energy and time and effort and money in fulfilling those emotional needs. That is important. It is so critical that I can't even begin to emphasize that enough. Well, what if you're on the brink of divorce already? Things are bad. Love has been lost. It's almost dead. It's just an ember there. Well, then you need to get some help. That's what you need to do. You need to humble yourself and you need to get some help. Listen, there is no shame, none, in admitting that the relationship is in a bad place. There is no shame in that at all. We're all human beings. We all know how tough it can be for two independent-minded human beings living together and thriving. And we all know how easily it is for a relationship to hit the rocks. We all know that. There is no shame in seeking help. So seek help. There's plenty of help out there. Ask someone that you trust. Ask me. I will be glad to. Maybe it's something I can help you with. Maybe I can help you work through some things. I'll recommend some resources to you, like Harley's book, His Needs, Her Needs, or there's plenty of other great resources out there. I can recommend a counselor who specializes in marriage and family issues that can be helpful to you. So seek out help. Another thing is be determined to keep your promise. Understand what God wants. This isn't a suggestion from God. This is a command of God. This is what He expects. Get determined that you're going to keep that. And that divorce is not going to be an option. And it doesn't matter how much love has died. It doesn't matter how much that flame has gone out. It doesn't matter if it has totally gone out and there's not even an ember there. If you're determined to honor God's will for marriage and your spouse is determined to honor God's will for marriage, you can rebuild it. That fire can be restarted again and that marriage can thrive once again. With God's help, a marriage can rise from the ashes. I've seen it before. Maybe you've experienced that before. And so if you're on the brink of divorce, Get help. There are resources and there are plenty of things to help you do that. We've got to start taking this seriously. Now, I know most of you do, but we've got to keep pounding this. We've got to keep pounding this to the next generation. It's not enough to teach God's plan for marriage, once every 5 years. This has to be regularly taught. And I'm not just talking about in a church setting like what we're doing right now. I'm not talking about just from the pulpit from time to time, which that will continue to happen as long as I feel the pulpit here at Concord Road. It has to happen at home. Listen, talk to your kids about it. Emphasize it. Help them understand how serious God is about this. Talk to your grandkids about it. Listen, that's a prerogative you have even as a grandparent. It's part of your business. You love them, don't you? Just be that reinforcement that hopefully their parents are being on, hey, listen, it's not going to be long before guys are going to be knocking at your door, before you're going to be knocking at the door of some young ladies, and you're going to start dating. Listen, you better start thinking about right now marriage. Don't say, oh, no, I'm not, Dad, I don't want to talk, Grandpa, I don't want to, no. I'm not telling you, I'm not suggesting that you're going to walk down the aisle in the next 30 days. I'm just telling you this. Let's understand God's will. God says you have to be married for life. And you better choose carefully. You got one shot. And so when you guys start asking you out or you start asking girls out, you better know what they are and who they are. And you better date with your brain. So we need to talk about this frequently. And again, we need to talk about it to people who are married, because marriages are struggling. They're floundering. They are weak. They are dying. And we need to help one another understand that there are resources out there. There are wonderful things that God, through His providence, has brought to us that can help us. If you're open to saving your marriage, God can help you. Okay. Well, thanks for tuning in for another lesson on the Beatitudes. And Sunday, we will continue on with verse 33. Until then, have a great rest of the week. God bless. Take care.